Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. If you're a longtime listener of this show, you'll know I have a deep affinity and appreciation for a 5-year stretch of time teaching religious studies in a high school in Columbia Public Schools in Missouri. My mentor, George Frizzell, founded the religion course in the late 80s and early 90s at Hickman High School, right on the business loop on the I-70 corridor. I taught down the road at Battle High School, but planned closely with the team over at Hickman, and they became dear friends. As George was transitioning out of the classroom full-time, he gradually retired into a life more focused on religious diversity training at local businesses and the public library in town. His courses at Hickman shifted to a new teacher, John McFarland, who worked closely with George to retain the spirit and quality the students had come to expect with George at the helm. As the years have passed, John and I have remained friends even after I moved to New York, and I am so delighted to have had the chance to catch up with him for this episode. John is teaching classical ideas and world religions right now, and he is now on the Classical Ideas podcast, finally. As you may have noticed from my social media or from episode 171, our mutual mentor George Frizzell passed away in May. John and I recorded this chat just before George passed, and we both took time to process that loss and what George meant to us. In episode 171, I did a long tribute episode to George where I compiled stories sent in by George's friends, family, and colleagues. John submitted an audio file that got lost in my deluge of texts and emails, and I completely missed it, putting it in the show. Fortunately, John pointed it out right away. Thanks for listening, John. I appreciated that. And I knew I was going to put out this episode with John just by himself as episode 172, so John's audio tribute to George is the lead for this episode. It should have been in episode 171, but it will start this episode instead. John recorded his tribute after George's passing, and the actual conversation between us takes place before George's passing. It's odd to think about the before and after here, and how I've reversed them here to be the after leading the episode, and then the conversation in the before. And to think about all the befores, in air quotes, we could talk about right now, living through 2020 in the United States, is a little overwhelming. This episode is about teaching high school religious studies. It's about planning, thoughtful curriculum, the day-to-day life of working in the classroom, and what it all means to John and myself. If you're a teacher at any level, this is for you. John and I taught the same class 5 miles apart for years, and this was a real treat for me to reconnect with John after being out of that job for the last couple of years. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with John McFarland, Classical Ideas and World Religions teacher at Hickman High School in Columbia, Missouri.
George and I worked closely together for 7 years at Hickman High School. First, while he was mentoring me to teach classical ideas. I would sit in during my conference times and watch him capture the imagination of his students with his humor, his stories, and his goofy special effects on his PowerPoint slides, like typewriter sounds, swipes, and spins. He got especially excited about a twinkling image of Krishna. The best image he showed was a picture of himself with a monkey sitting on his shoulders. I think he was in Costa Rica, and the story goes that this was a female monkey who had taken quite a liking to him. George never could grow any facial hair, whereas I am known for my beard. When this would come up, he would say that some of us are more evolved than others. Well, George, at least I never had a monkey fall in love with me. I wish I had made this retort to him, but I'll admit I tended to be too much in awe to do so. I remember the first couple of times George and Phil Overeem, the two teachers I most wanted to be, came to my house for a movie club that Jenny Lennon had put together. I was so nervous I definitely drank too much, definitely spilled at least one cocktail, and basically forgot how to cook. George, on the other hand, was perfectly happy with his trademark sparkling grape juice. His all-time favorite movie was Children of Paradise, a hilarious black-and-white masterpiece of French cinema that his father took him to see as a kid. This was a recurring theme when discussing films with George, and speaks to the influence of his father. After a couple of years, I got my own section of classical ideas, and this is when George began teaching me the deep mysteries. Many things I'll always emulate, like how to keep a calendar, schedule guest speakers, and get your students' pictures in the newspaper. A few tricks I never did learn, though, like his indecipherable numerical coding system for student identities that he had learned from his mother. She was his true hero and role model. Apparently Beaumont, Texas, of George's childhood was full of interesting folks. When I went to see the blues musician Johnny Winter with George, I learned that they had gone to Sunday school together. There were so many colorful pieces that made up the puzzle of George Frizzell. The last time I ate a meal with him was a double date of sorts, George and Susie and me and Carrie. They had recently visited Italy, and we wanted to hear all about it. In the dark, jazzy atmosphere of Murray's, George characteristically helped himself to bites from Susie's plate as we conjured images of the classical world. The awe in his voice as he spoke about Raphael's The School of Athens is something I'll never forget. "It's so big," he said. "You know the poster in our classroom? Just imagine that it's the whole wall." I feel connected to that world where Plato and Aristotle argue about the universe through George, as though he were there. I haven't been back in that classroom since the COVID-19 pandemic began, but I have been thinking a lot about how it will feel to step back into that space where his perfectly organized mess of papers used to be piled, where the posters of Hindu deities he bartered for on the streets of Delhi still hang along with his enormous Beatles poster and, of course, the School of Athens. I will probably, out of habit, be half expecting to hear him say, "Hey, Big John," as he walks in for a chat. One side note about those Hindu posters: he bartered the merchant down to a ridiculously low price, then tipped him enough to make up for the full price. Classic George. I'm going to miss him a lot, and I will think about him every time I eat pizza at an Amnesty International meeting, especially if it's banana pepper, a discovery he made only a few years ago and which significantly altered his views on pizza toppings. I'll think about him every year when we watch his favorite episode of the Mahabharata and laugh about the special effects, and when I teach his favorite lesson about Rastafarianism, which is mostly just listening to reggae music. You will be missed, George, and your joyful, generous spirit will live on.
John McFarland, welcome to Classical Ideas Podcast.
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
So, John, I know that you and I know each other, but the audience doesn't know you. So could you just spend a moment and introduce yourself however you see fit?
Sure. My name is Jonathan McFarland. I live in Columbia, Missouri, home of the University of Missouri and former home of Greg Soden.
Woo!
Yeah. And I teach English and classical ideas and world religions at Hickman High School, the only high school in the world with a Kewpie for its mascot.
And a Kewpie, for those who don't know, is what?
It's a little naked baby that apparently was super popular back in the 1920s, these little dolls with curly Q heads. So it's not a very intimidating mascot if you're out on the football field or lacrosse pitch or whatever, but we love it. It's
Nice.
A unique thing. So I've been teaching for 15 years, and my wife's an occupational therapist. I've got 2 kids in middle school. And that's pretty much me. I like music, like reading, like books.
So, John, you consider yourself an English teacher first and foremost, right?
Yeah, well, that's been interesting because for the first 10 years or so of my teaching career, that's exactly what I was, and so that's where I'm coming from. But I think I'm in such an interesting position now with the classes I teach, having classical ideas and world religions, but then I also teach a honors civics class for freshmen, which is a combined government and English class, and I'm the English guy. And then I have a co-teacher who is the government teacher, and we teach it together.
every day. And so I am so far into, the social studies and humanities and history world too, that I kind of feel like I'm a little bit of both at this point. But my expertise is more in the English way, but also with a background in religion, which I'm sure we'll get into. So.
Awesome. So let's talk about that specifically, since that's sort of like the focus of the show and what sort of brought you and I together.
Yeah.
So just my impression of, you as a colleague of mine is that you were teaching classical ideas and world religions at Hickman High School. I was teaching classical ideas and world religions at Battle High School. And I started off teaching it, whenever the school offered it for the first time. And then you started teaching it when our mutual friend and mentor, Mr. George Frizzell, was retiring from Hickman.
That's
so
right.
Can you tell me a little bit about the path of getting into this job of teaching religious studies at the high school level? Like, how did you sort of chart this course for yourself?
For sure. Yeah. So, you explained that really well. That so the teacher who started this class at Hickman High School, literally something like 30 years ago, George Frizzell, great friend and mentor to both of us, was retiring soon as I was arriving at Hickman. I had just moved to Columbia, and he found out about my background, which I'll explain, and was like, "Oh, you've got this background in religion, and so I'm going to need somebody to take this over. So let me start mentoring you to do that," which he did. I started out by sitting in his classes, and then we actually taught together for a year where he had a couple sections and I had one section. And then when he retired, I just, was able to take it. And so it was a great way into it. I can't imagine a better way of being introduced to teaching a new subject. But before I mentioned I've been a teacher for 15 years now. Before that, I did youth ministry for 5 years. And that was actually my major in college. I was a youth ministry major, English minor, at Greenville College, which is a small Free Methodist Christian liberal arts college in Southern Illinois. And I spent a couple years up in the Chicago suburbs at a Methodist church, and then a couple years in the suburbs of St. Louis, at a non-denominational church, and then just kind of figured out that teaching was really what I wanted to do, and got a job actually teaching high school English at the small town school where my wife graduated from, Wellsville, Missouri, and was there for 8 years, did my master's degree at Columbia College during that time in teaching. Anyways, after 8 years, we moved to Columbia because we kind of figured out that's where we wanted to be, and here we are.
So, John, I got a question to follow up on that. So you came at it like were you a lifelong Methodist?
My family growing up, we were Nazarene.
Okay.
And then I also, I was big in Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and went to kind of a big non-denominational church youth group with some friends. But Greenville College was really my sort of segue, I guess, into the Methodist world. But it's Free Methodist, which is not United Methodist. It's a smaller, somewhat more evangelical denomination. But I just happened to, when I started looking for jobs after graduation, I was really looking in the Chicago area because I really, really liked Chicago, and was wanting to try to get up there, and got a job in Park Ridge, Illinois, at the First United Methodist Church there. So, were you
ever interested in other religions during any of this time, or did you start getting exposed to other religions when you came to Columbia and working at Hickman?
Great question.
Yeah, did you have any exposure to that?
Yeah, no, I did, absolutely. So, when I was a freshman in college, where there was this required class that all the freshmen had to take called Bible and Culture. And one of the things you do in that class is go to this field trip up to Chicago, which is what kind of planted the seed of Chicago in my mind, I think, where you spend the weekend going to a mosque and a synagogue, a Hare Krishna Consciousness Center, a Buddhist temple, just, all over the place, the Hindu temple. And that, I think that experience really sparked a huge interest in world religions for me. Really opened my mind up. And then, so I think my senior year, then I actually was able to take a world religions class and do that same field trip again with a few different locations. And so from that point on, I was, just on my own, was always reading up on various religions and was always really interested in it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's not like something that's super self-evident to a lot of folks. You grow up in a tradition, and a lot of times we don't really explore outside of our own traditions. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So I was really lucky. I think my college did a really good job of not being, even though it was a Christian college, it was very much about, hey, let's ask a lot of questions. And really think about this and, expose ourselves to a variety of ideas. And I really benefited from that. So,
and I would imagine that still inspires your teaching methods to this day.
For sure. And there's specific professors that I think about there whose styles I emulate as far as how they try to, draw students out into conversation. And we're just genuinely like, interesting, fascinating people in and of themselves, and genuinely loved learning. And, and that really came out, and they were interested in us as people. And I think that made a huge difference. And so that's the way I try to approach my teaching is it's like, I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know where you're coming from. Let's start there. And then we can try to connect this content to where you're at.
Nice.
Right now. Yeah.
Well, you and I sort of, we followed George's lead a lot, I think.
Yeah.
Whenever we were structuring our versions of the course, and I know how much I modified over the years of teaching the class based on what I was personally like reading and finding on my own. So the way my class ended before I moved was very, very different from what George ended his class on. But I think that was totally to be expected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would imagine that your course, since you and George were, planning together and like a little PLC over at Hickman together, that your course might have been a little more similar to each other than it was to mine. Yeah. But you now have been teaching the class as the only teacher at the school now for several years. How long have you been doing it just solely by yourself?
3 years, I think.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is if you can take me through like a tour of your course and how you order your year.
Yeah, for sure. So and once again, you explained that really well as far as like the basis of the structure definitely comes from George and the way that he had structured it over years and years. And so for me, it's kind of a very gradual modification from that. And I really benefited from seeing what you were doing too. And I'm really grateful for that because I saw different approaches that I've been incorporating too. So I'm kind of a hybrid of your two approaches and then gradually kind of also making it my own. So very much like George did, we kind of focus first on philosophy and then on Eastern religions for the rest of first semester. So we'll go Greek philosophy, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Shinto. And then I have a new thing that's a philosophy project that I'll tell you about.
Sweet.
And then second semester, we go with religions and philosophies of China, and then Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, and Baha'i.
So you end on Baha'i?
Yeah. And there have been years, and one of my goals soon is to keep streamlining things a little more so that we can do a unit on Yoruba religion. And I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to put that yet, but that's probably going to happen next year. But, so I've expanded the Greek philosophy unit, and another goal of mine too is to continue to expand what we do with philosophy and that aspect of the course as opposed to only religion.
Do you feel like the students have demanded more philosophy? Is there like an argument that they're putting forth in favor of that approach?
Well, it's more of when I try it out, I get really good feedback from
Oh,
it.
nice.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'd say it was a demand, but anytime we do any, they're really into it. Um, so so there was an assignment that George always did at the beginning of the year that I thought was really cool, that kind of sparked this, where he would give them a series of questions like, what is the nature of the universe? What is good art? Do we have free will? Those sorts of, big philosophical questions. And as a way to almost get to know them a little bit, he would have them write a short paper, like a kind of an informal paper, on what they think about that question right now. And then they did that at the beginning of the year, and then went on to some other things, which was really cool. Like there was a bit about Paleolithic religion, like cave paintings and that sort of thing, that for a couple of years I actually expanded a bit, and now I've gotten rid of that. Even though I think it's really fun to do, but I expanded that philosophy writing into a short unit on Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then beyond a little bit like into Epicurus and Marcus Aurelius and those sorts of things. So we spend a few weeks on that now. But that paper that he had them write at the beginning, where they had all the questions, I've turned that into a semester-long project.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So at the end of first semester now, we spend finals week with students giving presentations on some piece of art or something that they've created that addresses one of those questions. So the way that's set up is that, we still kind of do that writing at the beginning to get them to start thinking about it and trying out different questions. But then about halfway through the semester, they have to turn in an annotated bibliography that shows the research that they've done on what have philosophers throughout time said in response to this question. And then after that phase, then they take what they've learned and put it into some sort of creative project where, I've had a lot of videos, a lot of visual art, both 2D and 3D, like some little booklets, some short stories, poems, all those sorts of things. And then the last few days of the semester, then they present those to the class and talk about their projects, and we get to see them. We had one kid this year do a virtual reality project, and he actually brought in his computer and his whole setup with the virtual reality glasses, and we got to all try it out. And, it's been really fun. So I continue to expand that and try to make it better, and it's turned into a pretty cool thing. So.
Has anybody done written any songs or music where they have to come in and actually perform it?
Yes. Yeah. We've had that too. Yeah, absolutely. We had one I think we get about one or two of those a year. I've been doing this for a couple of years now. So, definitely.
Awesome.
We had a guy with his guitar who played a song for us this year. And, it's a whole lot of fun. It's a whole lot of fun. And I think they get a lot out of it. So.
Very cool. So you kind of gave me the order and the arc of your school year. So there might be, teachers listening out there who might be interested in doing a course like this in their own high schools. So any sort of practical things that you say today are like maybe actually implemented from somebody who hears this.
Sure.
So I'm curious how many days you ballpark spend within each religion, within each unit, like what gets more attention, what gets less, and like what's that spectrum like?
Yeah. So for the big ones, I shoot for 3 or 4 weeks when I'm planning. Hinduism possibly even more because it's so huge. We do it close to the beginning, and there's a lot of introduction to how to even like study religion as we're doing that. But Jainism usually follows Hinduism, and it could almost be lumped into the same unit. But I only spend a few days on that. We'll do like I'll do an introductory day. We'll have our guest speaker, and then we'll have there's like a Socratic that we do with this short story called The Monk's Story by Gita Metta. and then that's pretty much it for Jainism. And then we go into Buddhism, spend probably 4 weeks on that. And that's a nice flow as far as ideas building on each other and just the age of the religion and how Jainism and Buddhism both sprouted out of Hinduism. That tends to be a really productive order to put things in. The reason I do Shinto at the end of first semester is because it's fun.
Yes.
It probably gets a little more like time and attention than if you were just looking at the demographics of it. It doesn't really deserve that, but since it's pretty much only a Japanese thing, but its influence in popular culture right now is enormous. And so we always watch, we'll watch a Miyazaki film. We've done Princess Mononoke before, but I've been doing Spirited Away. And a lot of kids come into the class having already seen it, but usually they're excited to see it again. Some of them have seen it, a dozen times already, but to a lot of kids, it's new. And it's a really fun way to explore the influence of religion and popular culture.
Nice.
Yeah.
So we'll come back. There's a few things that I'm going to touch on later on that I want to come back to, such as like guest speakers and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, so say you have like a typical unit, right? So you have your Islam, Christianity, Judaism,
Yeah.
Jainism, Buddhism, etc. What do you do for like summative assessments, sort of like
Sure.
along the way, like throughout a unit, before you get to the end? Like, how are you sort of like, as the teacher, assessing along the way learning?
Yeah, great question. So, so for a summative, as far as like the ending, big grade for the unit, I'll usually do that in two parts. I still do traditional, like a traditional multiple choice, fill in the blank sort of test with them over just the content knowledge, but then I'll also have another piece to it where, like with our Judaism unit. They give a presentation over, like, I've got stories from Genesis and Exodus that they choose from. Everybody gets one. We kind of like jigsaw the whole, story. And, they put together a presentation that's both telling the story and then doing some literary analysis and contextualization on it. And then we present those all in order so that everybody gets this nice overarching view of
That's great.
Kind of how we get from the Garden of Eden to the golden calf, basically, is where it stretches. And then so that counts as part of their summative, and then everybody has to write a little summary of that whole overarching story, focusing on the theme of like exile and return and how you see that pattern.
Yeah, man, that's such a cool way of doing it too. Because like I would make them read like the whole book of Genesis or the whole book of Exodus, and like some of the results were absolutely amazing. But like I feel like the way that you're doing it is a little more. It's cool because that way like they get to tell the stories to each other and they get to kind of summarize their own understanding, but you still get the whole thing.
Sure. Yeah. It works pretty well. The thing you lose out on is, I do have to, there's only so many students in a class. And so, you can't do every story. And so, we end up leaving some things out, and it's always, as an editor, you're choosing your history, you're choosing which stories. It's like, oh, well, we left out Sodom and Gomorrah because we just didn't want to mess with having those conversations. And that's kind of a choice,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So I think different people could choose different ways to do it. But so that's one example of like, the other part of the big assessment that I'll do. So, like in the China unit, I'll have them do an essay along with the test. And they've got a few different subjects to choose from. One that focuses on Taoism, one that focuses on Confucianism, and one that focuses on like contemporary issues, like what's in the news, which there's a lot in the news about, religion in China.
Nice.
So kind of a combined traditional test and something a little deeper to go with that. But like along the way, as we're going, there'll usually be like little writings, more like text analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So, whatever, readings I give them, there might be an assignment, to take, this chunk of text and annotate it, summarize it, come back, discuss it. or I might have, like, for texts that they need some help with, I'll have some guiding questions on, and they'll write that. So so those sorts of assignments along the way.
Yeah.
We practice, but there's so much vocabulary in.
Oh, I know, it's crazy.
Yeah, and that was a part I think I really struggled with at the beginning, coming from an English background, was like, I just didn't have the feel for, like, how to make the social studies vocabulary learning kind of interesting. But technology's made that a lot easier.
Yeah.
With things like Quizlet and Kahoot and Gimkit, like utilizing those as like vocabulary review tools in class has been really helpful, and it makes everything more efficient. And so that, I do lecture, but I try to, like, not, I try to just make that one piece of what we do. I'll lecture and then kind of turn it over to them. Then, it'll be, they've got their notes and they've got resources for studying vocabulary. We'll review vocabulary in class. And then it's just like, let's look at texts. Let's have a guest speaker. Let's watch a film. Keep talking the whole way, and then, get ready for the tests.
So, first of all, thank you for sort of talking about formative and summatives. Whenever I asked the question initially, I said summative whenever I really meant formative. So I asked the wrong question. So that's totally fine.
No worries. Yeah.
So something that you keep sort of referring to is something that I felt we did very, very well, and which was a very special part of the class itself, is the inclusion of many guest speakers.
Yes.
And that is a very crucial part of the job that I feel like you and I both do really well. And I think that George modeled how to do it very well, because he was all about cultivating relationships in the community with the guests, so that whenever a person would come in, they would often come in for years and years at a time. And they also were really, really good about towing the line about what is, like, constitutionally appropriate within the room. You know what I mean? Like, I only had one person ever where I had to sort of stop the class and redirect entirely because the person was crossing what I felt was an inappropriate constitutional line.
Right.
And so I feel like we did guest speakers very well. But if you read the literature out there in the world about guest speakers can be a very controversial thing to include in a classroom. So I'm curious how you are approaching your guest speakers, how your students prepare for them, how you as the teacher build relationships with the people that come into your room. I just kind of want to know all about your approach to guest speakers, any methods, any cautionary tales, anything that you have to say about that is totally cool.
Yeah. So it's funny because I, like we've talked about, like, coming into this situation, following up George, it was so well established for me that it's been pretty easy. I've inherited so many good guest speakers from him. And then seeing how that relationship works has made it easier for me to then, reach out and find more. And then I also, there was a supportive environment of that cultivated in the school, because everybody knows that, like, classical ideas is great because you get all these guest speakers in. And the community, like neighbors of mine, are like, oh my gosh, I took George's class. So I don't, I haven't had to deal with much negativity at all as far as that's concerned. But so I have been able to expand on that a little bit too. Like there's a guest speaker that we get now, Dr. Rich Keenan, who teaches philosophy at Westminster.
Awesome.
And he comes in and talks about ethics. We've gotten a series of really interesting guest speakers from Show Me Dharma, who come in and do some meditation with us. Which
Does Terry come in?
Terry's been in, and then he was gone to India for a while, and so then that sort of started the chain of like getting a few different folks. Like we got this guy Mark Wax a couple years ago. This year we had Anna Wilson, and they're all just such interesting people, and they've done meditation with us, which I think 10 years ago would have probably felt a lot more controversial
For
than
sure.
it does now. But everybody's into mindfulness now, and like the culture kind of gets it that like you can do meditation and it's not necessarily, you're not converting to Buddhism, so to
Right.
speak, if you're doing that. And so it's pretty widely accepted. So, but as far as tips go or whatever, I think that I think the community recognizes that it's okay because we get people from all the different religions. Like if I was only bringing in speakers on Buddhism, or if I was only bringing in speakers on Christianity or something like that, I think that would be a problem.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that like we do it and stay on top of it and keep it going, and keep up those relationships, and keep people coming in, and you get all these variety of perspectives. It's like people know that's what the class is about already, and so they're okay with it. So I haven't really gotten any problems with it, but and I find that it's funny, as teachers you feel like, oh yeah, school, right, like the normal thing, but like most adults completely lose touch of what it's like in a high school and find it really interesting to go into a high school and have some contact with teenagers. I think that the best speakers find that really exciting. So there's people out there that are just willing to do that sort of thing and looking to do that sort of thing, and it's not always the minister themselves necessarily. So one great example of that is Mary Hardigan, as
Yes.
Greg. That
Amazing.
Yeah.
She was on this show too. She was one of my earliest guests.
Yeah. Oh, she's phenomenal. I love her. And so she is, she's a practitioner of Judaism. She's not a rabbi.
Right. She's a convert too.
She's a convert. Yeah. She grew up Irish Catholic. And, anyways, yeah. So I guess when she first started coming, George had contacted the local rabbi, and he was like, well, yeah, I would do that, but who would be really good?
Yeah. Mary's so fun.
Yeah. Is Mary. And so, Dr. Gopal, I think, is another great example of that. Once again, as Greg, that like,
yeah, he was on the show too.
Yep, absolutely. So, he's a professor at MU in some sort of engineering, works with he always ends up telling us little stories about the fractures in concrete.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's people out there, and so I think just a little bit of reaching out. It might not be the first person you talk to, but they might lead you to somebody.
Oh, for sure. And you never know who's going to say yes too. You know what I mean? That's why I ask everybody all kinds of stuff to come on this show, and you never know who's going to say yes.
Right.
People are so much cooler than I think that we give them credit for in this day and age. We're always so negative about the world. Not we, but we tend as people.
There's a lot of negativity out there.
Yeah, man.
For sure.
So do you manage to get a guest speaker for every unit?
Most units. I haven't. So sometimes I get a speaker for Sikhism, and sometimes I don't. Mm-hmm. I haven't had anybody for Shinto.
Recently. I know somebody.
Yeah, I need to get in touch with that person. And I've reached out to different people for our China unit, and it seems like that should be easy, but it hasn't worked out for one reason or another. So yeah. But for every other one, yeah, absolutely. And one more thing I'll say about that too is as far as asking everybody, parents can sometimes be great resources. Dr. Geenan, the philosophy professor I told you about, he's a parent of a student who I had a few years ago. And I had a parent come to talk about Hinduism one time, and it was really fun because he had this completely different approach to our other Hinduism guest speaker, where he just had all these movies that he brought over from India.
Nice.
And he was devotee of Shiva very strongly. And whereas our other guest speaker, I think, is a more kind of open, sort of almost non-denominational, inclusive kind of practitioner. And so he had all these films about the stories about Shiva and they were all in Hindi with no translation. And so he would just show these films and just like talk over them and like explain to us what was going on.
Oh, that is so cool.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah. So yeah, there's lots of surprises out there. So I would, just go for it. Right?
Man, I've got this, and I just pulled this book off my shelf next to me. It's Stories of Shiva 5 in 1 from Amar Chitrakata, which is that Hinduism graphic novel series that you use.
Great.
Yeah, the Ramayana one that you have. Yeah. I borrowed those all from you, and I've bought so many more books from that series.
That's fantastic.
And they're all sitting here next to me on the shelf. I've got like the entire collection.
That's amazing.
So I just pulled down 5 in 1 Stories of Shiva, and I'm going to read this later on, I think now. Awesome.
That is awesome.
So do you manage to, and you get somebody for Jainism too, right?
Yeah. Nishant Jain,
yep.
who you had on the show as well, I think, right?
Yeah, definitely. He's my buddy. Love him.
Oh, man. I always tell everybody, like my students, okay, guys, Nish is coming. He's the nicest person you will ever meet in your life.
Absolutely.
Like, he doesn't fail to impress. He's so cool.
Nice. Okay, so I want to talk about reading for a little bit. And how you kind of go about this. So how much do you make the students read as far as like primary sources go? Because this can get really intense, but it's also really, there's so much choice. Like think about the Quran or the Tao Te Ching or the Analects or the Gita or the Ramayana. Like how much primary source do you incorporate into the class?
Yeah, it's a really important part of the class. I think George did a really good job of establishing, like, this is not a class where we use a textbook. And I know a lot of people do, and I totally see the advantages of it. It's just not the way ours is set up. It's, all the reading that we do in primary text is super important. And you're right, there's so much to pick from. So I once again had a really good sort of established sort of almost canon of text or whatever that I've modified and expanded on as well. So like with our Hinduism unit, like the Bhagavad Gita, we read the whole thing. It's not a long text. Like they're assigned to read the whole thing, but we really only focus on a few sections. Right. So it's like, here's, take some time to read this, read the whole thing. And then I really want you to focus on sections like, 2, 3, 4, and 11. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about where you see these specific ideas in those sections. And so even though like there's not, I don't assign really long readings most of the time in the class. It's a challenge because it's a different kind of text than they are used to. These students have never encountered these sorts of texts, for the most part. Some of them have certain ones, but you have to approach them very differently. And so it's really important to always set a purpose for reading when you approach those. So, when we go to the Bhagavad Gita, it's like, okay, we're going to talk about, what is karma, what is dharma, what is monotheistic polytheism? How does Krishna show us that? Like, these are the big ideas. Look for these. I want you to find passages where you think it's talking about those, and then, do a little writing on that. And then that's what we're going to talk about, first in little groups and then with the whole class. And then I can sort of address your questions after you show me, what you found. It's kind of my strategy for approaching any of those texts, really. Some texts can be really challenging too. Like I was so happy this year when I expanded the Greek philosophy unit. We got copies of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and I gave them some passages from that to read. So, I guess number one, I would never just hand them that book and be like, okay, read it, let's talk about it. It's like, here's some specific passages, here's some really specific questions that I've written on those passages that I want you to write to. Excuse me. And then we're going to talk about those. And that worked really well. And so you just have to make sure that you're building in the guidance that they need to find the important things, because it's that, determining of importance that can be so difficult, and sort of decoding the vocabulary as well with that.
Do you feel like you've designed any sort of like tools or graphic organizers or handouts that have been really successful for your students in documenting what they do along the way?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. I've got some I could send to you, I suppose. They're usually fairly specific to the content, but to be honest, I don't know if any teachers out there listening, if your schools have Avid, but I've done a lot of training in that, and they do talk a lot about literacy and a lot about close reading, and I modify and use their ideas a lot just for everything.
Nice.
It really applies, yeah.
Well, and it matters too which translation you're reading too. Like if you're reading like one version of the Bhagavad Gita versus another, or one Tao Te Ching versus another, like you would have to create individual resources oftentimes for both of them, because the translations can be so different from version to version.
For sure. And I think more so than any other class I've ever taught, you find yourself talking about the process of translation. Like, for example, we usually use like Stephen Mitchell's Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
And he will use male and female pronouns sort of alternating as his method of being gender inclusive. And kids sort of like, they notice that and they're like, what's going on here? Why is, and you say, okay, well, this, if we look at the translator's note at the beginning, we look at the introduction, he explains, this is how he's going about that. And it can also be confusing too. Say if you're reading a Hindu text and you see a word like sin or like heaven and hell and those sorts of things, which a translator, or like even in Buddhist texts, sometimes you'll see this, like a translator has made the attempt to connect with Western audiences by using a word that's familiar that kind of means what he means,
right.
But not exactly. And so some of the students will be like, well, wait a minute, I thought that like this religion didn't believe that or whatever. And so you kind of have to talk about that. So you have to be, as the teacher, I think, you bring up a really good point that like, it's really important for you to have read through and understand like any sort of introductory material that the translator is providing so that you can respond to those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Well, and like we would, I think that you guys read the Barbara Stoller Miller Bhagavad Gita, right?
Yeah.
And that's the one that we would read too. But then my students would also read the introductory chapter to Hinduism in Stephen Prothero's God Is Not One. So they would read Prothero, who says there's no concept like of sin in Hinduism, but then they would immediately read the Bhagavad Gita from Barbara Stoller Miller, where it talks about sin and heaven and hell. And then the students are like, come on, what is happening here? So I totally understand. I've had that exact experience, and it can be very frustrating to explain that. And then like just across town, you're reading the Stephen Mitchell Tao Te Ching, and across town I was reading the Stephen Addis and Stanley Lombardo Tao Te Ching, which is there is no gender within that one. So just like 5 miles away, you and I were reading different translations of the same text. Thought.
Yeah, for sure.
So
for sure.
Even a few miles away, the students are getting a totally different experience in reading something like the Tao Te Ching. So it varies so much depending just on the teacher. It can be so wild to wrap your brain around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
So I gave myself a good challenge this year too. I figured out that kind of over the last few years that when it came to our Chinese unit, that we were repeating a lot of material from AP World History, which a lot of my students had taken. We also have an AP Human Geography class that some of my students had taken, and so it wasn't very challenging for them. So it was just kind of like, because they did the Tao Te Ching, they did the Analects of Confucius, they did a lot of the same material. So it's like, okay, I need to throw something else into the mix here. So we've started also reading the book of Chuang-Tzu.
Oh wow, cool.
Yeah. So, and it went fine. Your first time teaching something is always, not as good as you figure out everything you do wrong and you'll be better at it next time.
Did they like reading Chuang-Tzu?
It was really challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was really challenging.
I've never taught that.
Yeah. And so I'm super excited to do it again. But what I found myself having to do, because, if you think that the Tao Te Ching is a little bit confusing, it's just confusing in an esoteric kind of way where you feel like, oh, this is all very abstract.
Yeah.
Chuang-Tzu is trying to confuse you. I feel that's what it feels like to me. It's like he is trying to throw you off. He's trying to, he contradicts himself, and it's very contrarian and it's very playful in that way. And in the stories that he's writing. And so I just found myself having to say, like, okay, guys, everything in this passage, in all of these sections that we're looking at, is about going with nature. So if you can find where it tells you to go with nature, you've got it in this passage, and so you just have to find that kernel of like, what's the big idea here and how can we pull it back to that. So
yeah. Like students, like I've often found that young students would have a trouble reading a long text if they don't understand every piece of it along the way, instead of looking for the kernels that they do get. Right. And sort of like dissecting what they think that means. They're like, I don't understand it from sentence to sentence. So it can be a totally different style of reading than if you were doing like a novel where you want to follow the intricacies of the plot per se, and the, get some foreshadowing in there and try to figure out what's going to happen and make predictions. Whereas reading something like the Tao Te Ching is a totally different style of reading.
Yeah, for sure.
And that can be hard for teachers.
Yeah. And sometimes, like with, especially with the Tao Te Ching, also the Gospel of Mark. Yeah. I tell them, guys, this is a great text to just read straight through. Oh yeah. And just don't even think too much. Usually I'm giving you assignments for do some annotating, do some summarizing, that kind of thing. Like that cold read of just let yourself go with it. Mm-hmm. And just read it from front to back, and then maybe come back and talk about it. Like there's texts like that are just like these immersive experiences that can be great for that. Like the Book of Ecclesiastes is great for that too. There's my students would always say how much they liked Jesus's secretiveness within the Gospel of Mark. Yes. They're like, he's so secretive. It's very mysterious. Right. Yeah. I always tell them, okay, guys, this is how the Gospel of Mark, this is what we start talking about the pattern. And it's like, Jesus goes here, boom, heals somebody, says, don't tell anybody about it. And immediately he goes somewhere else, boom, casts out a demon, immediately goes somewhere else. It's so fun. Yeah. And like the joy of being in a classroom with young people who are experiencing these types of things for the first time is that it can be so funny. They're like, oh, he's so secretive. And then like everybody's laughing together. And it's just an absolute joy to be in that type of situation where you're reading these types of really hard things, but then somebody will like crack the perfect joke at just the right time. Yeah. And then you're all in a group of 30 people, like just laughing together. And it's so awesome. It is. It's really joyful at times. Yeah. How many, how much do you think your class has changed in the last 5 years? Like how similar is it to when you taught it for the first time? Gosh, I'd say the overall structure is very similar, and the guest speakers, there's several of the same ones. And the lectures are, even though they're different, are still, based on what I was handed down to me. And we use a lot of the same texts. But I have, I've introduced some new texts like Nicomachean Ethics, Shuangzi, Galatians. We didn't read that before. And we use some different films. I kind of I don't think any of the same films that we used to use, except for Sita Sings the Blues.
Nice.
Yeah.
Such a great movie.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Have you had any guest speakers that have like bowed out over the years?
Yeah. So, Ray Ronci used to come. He was a Zen Buddhist, poet, professor. And I think he just kind of like his time was done. I think he was ready to just kind of, retreat a little further. Yeah. From everything. And so he has, but, everybody else is still, is still pretty much in it. I guess the Christianity panel would be the other thing where we've had a big rotation. So when we do our Christianity unit, we get 4 different, ministers from different, traditions to come in, and I've kind of had a rotating cast. Nice. Of those, which I like, because I like to get to know different people, and some people leave. And I had we actually had to cancel it this year because it was set to take place the week that we actually, school got cut short for
Coronavirus.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a real bummer, having to email everybody and be like, oh my gosh, you guys, like,
School's
you're not gonna
closed.
be able to come. Yeah. So, so I've kind of had a rotating cast of those folks, but
my last 2 years that I was there, like we would come over to Hickman for your panel, and then the next day we would have another panel. So I did 2 panels in a row.
That's awesome.
So like the first panel with you guys was arranged by you and George, but then the next class, students would come into my classroom at Battle, and there would be a second panel of all women clergy.
That's so cool.
So like we would have like 4 different denominations of Christianity, and every leader in the room was the leader of a congregation was a woman. Yeah. And it was so amazing. So I highly recommend doing that.
Well, it's funny.
In the future.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because this year I was actually, it was like an even split between women and men, because I do always try, George always said, I always try to get at least one woman, and it's like, okay, so I'm going to really focus on trying to get women in here. And I think I tried so hard to get women that it ended up getting more yeses from women than I did from men. And so, and since I've got 3 sections this year, there's one on A days and one on B days. We have this weird block schedule where we have rotating A days and B days. So I have classes on 2 different days, and I don't like to ask speakers to come 2 days in a row. I feel like that's just kind of too much to ask. And so anyways, I had several different people and quite a few women. So that was going to be really exciting, and we didn't get to do it.
But there's a super important conversation that students need to have in there as far as like who is ordained within different denominations. So, I mean, I think that's super cool.
Yeah, for sure.
How are you, how are you seeking to push yourself along the way? Like, are you in touch with any religious studies teachers around the country? Like, how are you kind of developing yourself professionally?
Sure.
Like, how are you pushing yourself?
That's a great question. So, I think towards the beginning of this conversation, you asked me, I think, something really good, which was like, okay, so you sort of see yourself primarily as an English teacher, because that's how I was sort of introducing myself. And I think it's kind of been a process for me of like shifting the way I see myself, because I have primarily seen myself as an English teacher. And at first it was like, oh, and I teach this, and so I think that like, I'm finally just now kind of getting to that point where it's like, I see this as my thing. And because this is what I'm spending most of my time doing, and I feel really lucky to do it. So I don't really have a great answer to that question as far as, I mean, I know that there's programs out there. Harvard has this really cool certification in religious studies education, and there's things out there like that probably I'll try to pursue something like that in the future. But like for me, it's just been continuing to read and continuing to kind of like I've always done, because I've always been interested in it, but reading new texts and just redeveloping units, and just challenging myself to improve the content that we have.
So as far as that goes, I'd imagine that you're sort of becoming known within Columbia as like a religion guy, like the guy who teaches about religion. So when friends or people in the community come to you and they're like, hey, what should I read? Like,
Sure.
What do you tell them?
Yeah. So, and once again, you've already mentioned God Is Not One by Stephen Prothero. If I was going to say, okay, if you just want one book to read that is going to cover all the major religions and give you a really good overview and insight, like that's the one I would suggest. I really like his focus on, it's gonna sound strange, but his focus on the differences in that book, because there's sort of this, people can kind of have, and it's a wonderful attitude and it's a really positive thing in the world to say that, like, all the religions have like this, everybody kind of has something in common, and they all have like a similar goal. And in terms of like religion saying, hey, love your neighbor. Yeah, that's true. And so they can kind of gloss over the true differences between them. And he does a really good job of explaining just exactly what those are, like how at the core they are responding to different problems, different questions, and providing answers to those different problems and different questions. And so I think that's a really good one. A lot of people are interested in mindfulness right now, like we talked about. A lot of people are interested in meditation. Takmian is a big name in that, and I think did a lot to popularize it. And so, like if I was going to read one book on that, it would be "You Are Here" by Takmian. As far as like scholars in Western religions go, I think Reza Aslan is fantastic. His book Zealot about Jesus, No God But God about Islam is fantastic. Karen Armstrong's really good, like her somewhat kind of biographical books about like Muhammad and about Buddha.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at her Buddha biography right now on my shelf.
Yeah, those are great. And then if you really want like like my favorite translator of Eastern texts right now is Eknath Easwaran.
Oh, he's amazing.
Yeah. He's got the Dhammapada and the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita.
I have all three of those right here.
Yep. So those are fantastic. Those would be my highest recommendations as far as books go. Yeah.
Nice. So I know that you started off your life like following the trajectories of Nazarenes and Methodism, like you said earlier. How do you think that you've changed mostly as a person after being exposed to all of this new information? Like, how are you still growing as a person?
Yeah. So I think that getting interested in world religions through a very sort of hands-on kind of way of like getting to participate and be in the midst of many different experiences in sort of a concentrated way in college, just the world, I think, got a lot bigger for me at that point. And I think that, so for me personally, like, I think that the desire to then, kind of like I was talking with Prothero, how just recognizing that there's a lot of different questions out there. And that, while Christianity might focus on the idea of like, okay, so what is my relationship to God in terms of like, I have sin in my life, or, and I need to be reconciled. And how do I do that? And we talked about, well, in other, Hinduism or Buddhism, you don't even have that idea of sin in the same way. Whereas, Hinduism is asking the question, like, what is my duty in life? Like, what is it that I'm, supposed to do? How should I perform action? Buddhism is saying, well, why do we suffer, and how can we stop that? Like, I find all of those questions important and fascinating and interesting questions to pursue. And so I think that my interest in all of these areas, and then in just the diversity and beauty of it all too, sort of was a part of decisions that I made in my life, not to pursue ordination at one point, not to, continue down that path and to pursue a different career and that kind of thing. And so it's been a huge part of my life all along. And now the fact that I get to continue to, as in my professional life, continue to learn more is really pretty wonderful for me. So it's had a huge, profound impact on me, and I think that it's put me in a good position to be able to teach a class like this, and it's something I really enjoy. So
why does it matter that you get to bring this experience to young Americans?
Yeah, well, they're a lot more fun. I think it is interesting to be, I think, as I grow older and I know people outside of education, I think that it's like, they always look to us as far as like, well, what is this thing that the kids are doing? Like, what are the cool new things? Like, and it continuing to stay in touch with youth culture, I think, is a whole lot of fun. And it's a very hopeful thing too. Like, it's easy to get bogged down in negativity when you're paying attention to, politics, and when you're paying attention to what's happening in the world all over the place. And, but, I think being around young people is definitely keeps hope alive for me, because I just see so many smart, wonderful kids all the time that I know are, gonna do great things and make the world a better place. And so, to me, it's a very worthwhile pursuit. It's one of the most, I think, ethical ways I could spend my life. So I find a lot of reward in that, I suppose.
Well, John, you have now spent 70 minutes with me today.
Oh my, yeah, that went by fast. Wow.
And I just wanted to tell you how much I value you in like the big picture of my professional life. I mean, you're right up there, man. Like,
Wow,
so
you.
As far as like all the people that I've ever worked with, I am very, very grateful that our paths managed to cross for a couple of years, and that we were able to collaborate on this amazing thing known as Classical Ideas.
Yeah.
And I'm just glad that I get to be a part of that story from Columbia, Missouri, where, a town that I lived for many years and love deeply to this day, even though I don't live there now. It's just an honor. And I'm so glad that I've been able to talk to George on this show, and now you on this show. And that's so we all keep this very, very important part of our lives central, and that we continue to value it and tell the world that we value it. Like doing this show, I'm telling the world that I value this project that I've been a part of, and I'm just glad that you and I were able to share that experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thanks a lot, man, for saying that. And same to you. Thank you so much for doing this. And man, it is great. You're providing a great resource for us, and yeah, I just appreciate who you are so much. So thank you.
Right on, John. Well, thanks for coming on the show, and I'm so glad that my audience is able to hear about the great work that you're doing in our small hometown city in the middle of Missouri.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com, or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.